Let's create our first project. When we first open up Xcode, this is the introductory welcome window that we see. And it will show any of our most recent projects. But what we want to do now is we want to create an entirely new project. So we click on Create a New Xcode Project. It'll ask us what kind of project we want to create. The default is a single view application. And that's what we're going to be creating for most of this course. A single view application doesn't necessarily mean that the application is limited to one page. It can certainly have multiple pages, and we'll see how to do that. It just means that there's a single view associated with the initial page. We can also create master detail applications, page-based applications, tabbed applications, and games. Xcode also supports watchOS and OS X, so you can create other kinds of projects there as long as you have the appropriate developer account. So we'll create our first single view application, and it will want a name. And we get to choose our language. And we can choose Swift or Objective-C. In this course, we're going to be using Swift. Swift is a recent creation of Apple, and it's a more modern looking language than Objective-C, and probably a bit simpler syntax. You can do pretty much anything in Swift that you would do in Objective-C, but Swift is probably going to be the future, as opposed to Objective-C is a bit in the past. We can also choose what devices we want our application to support. Universal will support iPhone and iPad, but we can choose to just create an iPhone app or an iPad app. And we'll just keep the defaults for the rest of the project. So let's create our project. And we'll need to choose a folder for that project. And we can choose to put it under source control using Git, which we'll not do in this case. And now our project is created. It'll initially display the general information about the project. Its bundle identifier that we've already talked about, version, build, any teams that are associated with the provisioning, what devices it can support, what the main interface is, different orientations that it can support, the app icon set, which we'll talk about much later, the launch screen, which we'll also talk about at that same time, and any kind of linked frameworks and libraries that we'll be putting in. And we'll see some of that as well. So these are the general properties of the application. A more advanced area that you may end up with is the build settings area. And this is an area which will tell you all about how the application gets built and linked. You can choose the architectures for the application, the assets, build locations, build options, how the application is signed, where it's deployed. Probably the most important area is the linking area and the search paths. If you're using any kind of external libraries, those are things that you'll need to get right. But we're at an intro stage, so this is not something we're going to be using much. Then we have the rest of the files in the application. And all applications are going to have an app delegate. And this is basically the first This is basically the first code that gets run when the application runs. It's essentially the starting point for the application. We typically don't put a lot of code in the app delegate. More likely, we go to our first view controller, and that's in our viewcontroller.swift. In this case, it has the standard default methods, view did load, and did receive memory warning. And you'll see that in all of our view controllers. And we'll talk about both of these methods and the other methods that we're going to be putting in. We also have the main storyboard. And the storyboard is where we can visually create the application's user interface. We'll spend a lot of time in the storyboard and a lot of time with the various controls. But let's take a look at the elements of Xcode's environment. We have our view controller, and in this case, this one is associated with viewcontroller.swift. So anything that we're going to be adding to this storyboard, we can associate with that view controller code. Down below, we can choose objects to be put on our storyboard. So there are a lot of objects, and we're going to be talking about most of them. Well, we have tab bars and page view controllers. We have labels, buttons, text boxes, switches, all of the usual user interface elements that you're used to seeing in iOS applications. I'm just going to put on a label real quickly so we can see some other things. So I've got my label here, and I can drag it anywhere I want in the view controller, and you'll see every so often I get these little guidelines. They effectively show me where margins are for the application. So at the top I've got a margin that allows the status bar to be there, and a little bit of a left margin. Now that I've selected an object in the view controller, I can come up to the top right and take a look at the various inspectors we have. First is the file inspector, and that is more appropriate for the actual view controller itself. So if I go back to the view controller, and I can select things in the scene over in this left-hand column. So if I go here, it'll give me the identity of the view controller and what type it is. And I can choose all sorts of different types, and we'll see in one case how we might want to use something a little bit different than the default. In general, you use the default. You also see what target memberships your view controller is in. This project actually has a few test projects in it as well. This view controller is not part of those test projects unless I check this area. Okay, so back to our label. We also can see the type for the particular label. And we can get some quick help. And the quick help is available throughout. When we're in code, we can also get quick help if we're confused or need some help on some sort of property or a method call. The identity inspector is where we might choose a custom class. By default, of course, when we add an object to a storyboard, the class will be chosen appropriately. So UI label will be associated with this label that we've just put on our storyboard. In some cases, we'll see that there are other subclasses that we can choose. In this case, it's just a UI label and we can't do anything else with it. There's not a lot else here that we'll be using very often. And we get into the attributes inspector, and this will be using a fair amount. This allows me to change all of the physical This allows me to change all the visual aspects of the object that I've chosen in the storyboard. So I can choose the text type. I can actually choose the text itself and change that into my label perhaps. And you can see the adjustment there, and I have to resize it to show it to you. I can change the color. And we get a color wheel, and we can choose whatever we want to in terms of that. And you can see the label is adjusting as I go through. I can choose the font size, the alignment of the label. So now I've got it center aligned. The number of lines, if I was to word wrap it, you can see it will take up 2 lines. If I go back down to that 1 line, you'll see it will not show the entire label. So we can set a number of user interface properties using the attributes inspector. And we'll be doing that with each one of the user interface objects that we work with. We also have the size inspector, and that's as you might expect. It controls the size of the object. It also has something called constraints, and we'll be talking about constraints as well. Constraints affect the way the controls are laid out. In the old days, when there was one size iPhone, this was fairly easy. But now, because there are different sizes of iPhones, in order to get your screens to look good, you have to use something called constraints so that things can adjust depending upon the different resolutions of the different screens. So we'll talk about those as well. And then finally, we have connections. And connections are what allow us to connect these user interface objects on the storyboard to our code. And we'll be using those in a little bit. So that's our first trip around Xcode, and we'll continue with this project in our next lesson.